Vanilla, an unofficial term used to describe monsters who bear no effects. There are many different aspects as to why the term vanilla applies to them. One of the more obvious is the fact normal monsters are the only cards in the game with flavor text, instead opting to provide some sort of description of the monster, or provide lore details through its text. Vanilla could also be derived from the fact that normal monsters have a close color to that of actual vanilla. The other potential root of the term vanilla could be in reference to how the cards are extremely basic, since vanilla is typically associated with being a basic taste. This basic nature has many of them being regarded as the most useless card type in the game. From a rudimentary level, they only have their stats and level to contribute to an actual game state. This has left it so most people disregard these cards entirely, since flat stats haven't meant much of anything even early on in the game's lifespan. However, I find myself deeply entranced by these cards. There's something just so fascinating about these cards. Cards that lack a defined strength, but by way of surrounding card design and game mechanics, have their true flavor brought out, giving them the potential to become even greater game pieces than cards with multiple effects. The compelling nature of an underdog that has unseen potential that you have to discover for yourself. Before I dive into discussing these cards, there is one thing to establish. There's a difference between normal monsters and non-effect monsters. All normal monsters are non-effect monsters, but not all non-effect monsters are normal monsters. For the sake of my sanity and the appeal of this video's title, I'm going to refer to them both under the umbrella term of vanilla generally, since I don't really see another worthwhile opportunity to talk about non-effects outside of this video. I'll talk about the specificity when it's relevant to the design quirks. I also won't be talking about Gemini too much here, because I already have at length before. Go watch that video if you haven't already. Lastly, I intend to make a video similar to this, but about traps as a whole at some point. So I decided to make a survey regarding them that I'll pin in the comments section. This just helps me have a better feel for how people view cards and mechanics. It helps with making these kinds of videos, so I appreciate it. Now on with the actual video. Regardless of how normal monsters are perceived now, they still have an enduring legacy. From Blue Eyes and Dark Magician remaining the face of this game, to the many other nostalgic DM-era vanillas. Some of these have a legacy as playground staples, and some are simply iconic anime cards that remain in our memory. Gemini Elf and Mechanical Chaser were the first normal monsters to really stick out in the game's meta, as they would raise the cap of an attack stat for a normal summonable monster, at least on ones that didn't have some sort of downside. Nowadays, there are plenty of level 4 monsters with 2000 attack and no one bats an eye, but this was the only gameplay legacy these cards held early on. Another facet of their legacy is in the more obscure normal monsters, ones that had purpose in games like Forbidden Memories and Duelists of the Roses. Kairyu Shin, Akihiron, Sea King Dragon, Octobursers, and Spike Seadra. These are all cards that held absolutely no presence in the physical card game, but because of the design present in Duelist of the Roses, they shaped an actual strategy with a water deck. So, a lot of vanillas have a legacy beyond just the actual game itself. There are just so many more vanillas from this era that I'm just forgetting. You didn't mention WoW Warrior, video sucks. While I could go on for minutes listing off more of these obscure vanilla monsters, with over 700 of them in the game, I'd like to actually discuss the ones on my radar that have something of actual substance to remark on. Momentotem, while not a deck of normal monsters, clearly pays homage to an assortment of forgotten normal monsters. From the more popular obscure vanillas like Darkblade, to the who's of Goblin Calligrapher and Duelists of the Roses classic, the #1 Aqua Dragon material, the GOAT himself, Akihiron. I'd like to see another archetype like Memento that focuses more specifically on Forbidden Memories and Duelists of the Roses classics. But I don't think every single vanilla needs to be retrained into an effect monster. With the beginning of the GX era, normals would also have a legacy in the original E-heroes, with 4 of the first few heroes introduced being normal. Wait, 4? In pushing fusion to the forefront of the series, this was an opportunity to utilize normal monsters in a new way, having them fuse into a monster that has an actual effect. Unlike Flame Swordsman, who would fuse 2 normal monsters for another vanilla, a vanilla that loses to Gemini Elf, While decks weren't quite consistent, and fusions weren't relatively generic, the hero fusions would be a salient way to convert these previously perceived worthless cards into decent threats. On the playground, that is. I mean, what did you expect printing these in the same era? The concept is at the very least appreciated, even if the execution was rather lacking. Neos would also be another normal hero introduced later, but the existence of Neos highlighted the remaining issue with high-level vanillas. It's no secret that even early on, tribute summons were pretty bad. Committing 1 or 2 resources to a card that would fold to a single piece of removal in a game overflowing with removal isn't very economical. While tribute monsters with effects would give genuine value to tributing, the same could not be said for their effectless counterparts. At this point in the game's design, they weren't exactly eager to let you cheat out big vanillas reliably, so they were left doing mostly nothing. The closest you got were cards like Fake Hero and Ancient Rule, cheating them out of hand, but these were never good either. The advent of Gem Knights would be a second interpretation of the original E-Heroes, since nearly all of them were normal monsters, with a select few effect monsters, and a cute attempt at integrating Gemini in as well. Brilliant Fusion and Seraphonite would ensure these cards endure a legacy in the game's history. Also the FTKs. Whoops. However, Brilliant Fusion's legacy also contributed to perpetuate the perception of normals being a liability, as the term Garnet was born from the very card itself. A term for a card you don't want to draw, with Garnet assuming the title because it was the target with the highest attack stat. Therefore, it held more application than the other Gem Knights. While Garnet isn't a term exclusive to vanilla monsters, it maintains the idea that they're otherwise useless, with its only application being its stats and its mandatory inclusion in the engine. Psyframe Driver is another vanilla Garnet, but instead of powering a strong combo engine for a deck, it's there for associated hand traps. I really don't know what the game plan was with Psyframe's design. They're intended to be a synchro deck that interrupts your opponent and performs synchros on their turn, but it doesn't really do that all too well. None of their guys can be summoned regularly, so they're entirely reliant on your opponent to do things. The tuners are designed more like hand traps and lead me to believe the reason Driver is a vanilla was an attempt to dissuade players from using them generically. This did not work out before, and it did not work out now. It feels like an instance of Konami underestimating vanillas. Before Garnet and Psyframe though, there was a Garnet that predated them, Gen X Controller. Because of Gen X Undyne, Controller was a vanilla you were forced to run for the payoff of being able to send a water to grave. This saw play, but considering the fact we call these cards Garnets instead of Controllers, you can tell which one had a greater impact on the game's legacy. While Gem Knights came out only a short year after it, it wouldn't be until 2015, 4 years after their release, that Brilliant Fusion cemented them in the game's history for better or worse, highlighting the fact vanillas only leave their mark if it's one that's massive. Speaking of sending a water to grave, a deck consisting of solely normal monsters. Paleo. Yes, Paleos are trap cards, but they become normal monsters when summoned by their own effect. While the fact they're normal monsters doesn't really matter, it's still something to note. You could play stupid things like Order to Smash or Tyrant's Throws in Paleo. Hell, you could convert them to Dinos with Survival's End. I don't think these are remotely good, but it leaves open the ability to use these sorts of normal support cards with them. The fact there were trap cards and normal monsters highlighted how versatile vanillas can be in design. While Paleo didn't usher in a revolution for normal monsters, the addition of pendulums did, harnessing this versatility in full force. Cards like Summoner's Art and Painful Decision had been recontextualized into powerful scale searchers. Summoner's Art and Decision functionally allowed you to search any pen scale with the existence of normal pendulum monsters. Not too long after this discovery, Summoner's Art would now be capable of searching Clifford Scout, the best card in an actual meta contending archetype. While Ignites weren't a meta deck themselves, they also managed to utilize the same beneficial normal support cards to perform extremely well. This time with Ignite wasn't the spotlight fading, but simply changing. Metal Foes would take this utility even further. Metal Foes were a pendulum archetype that were almost all normals, with them all using their scale effects to pop cards to retrieve spell traps from the archetype. Once again, these two cards would prove their mettle, making it easy to search out scales in the deck, and in the case of Metal Foes, actually make use of them as monsters. being able to use Volflame as a big beater you could pen down. It also helped that metal foes were able to perfectly slot in Zodiac during its peak. I'd consider this era to be the golden age for vanillas. Ironically, Blue Eyes' meta spotlight around the same era would actively harm this advancement, creating an idiot that just negates a special summon. When it comes to Blue Eyes and Dark Magician, I've never felt like they were decks that actually embraced their vanillas, at least not in ways that contribute to unique gameplay, relying mostly on their names and legacy to sell you on the deck, which I find to be especially egregious in the case of Dark Magician, considering all the sorts of trickery and magic the archetype is centered around. And considering how Geminis revolve around the idea of being able to turn on their effects, it's bizarre to me they haven't utilized that fact with Dark Magician's theming. Of course you're gonna say, Dark Magician doesn't need more worthless cards like Geminis. But for those of you who haven't watched the Gemini video, Geminis don't have anything stating they can't have effects in hand. Konami just hasn't bothered to print ones that do, either because the thought hadn't occurred to them, or because they'd rather not officiate a reason as to why you can't have effects in one of the only places that the cards are effect monsters. Regardless, Blue Eyes at least got the opportunity to be in a world's winning deck, something that can't be said about most vanillas in the game. Azure and the spell based off of it at least did make use of the cards being vanilla, being somewhat of a restriction that focused more on the beatdown potential and less on the more broken side of reborning at the time. Konami had found a way to entirely warp the perception of what being a normal monster meant, as with pendulums they held more potential than just the stats on them. They were also scales with potentially powerful effects in the pendulum zone. And with the sheer amount of monsters you could summon in a pendulum summon, they were just their raw stats on summon, making it so things couldn't get too out of hand with a lot of powerful effects attached to them as monsters, at least not without converting them into other extra deck monsters. Pendulums would soon be gutted for a new Master Rule. However, this wouldn't be an end of a legacy for vanillas. This new Master Rule would actually manage to make good use of vanillas early on as well. The World Chalice archetype is one that revolves around mostly vanillas, just like Metal Foes and Ignites that came before it, but these weren't pendulums, so the utility aspect was discarded. They would now rely on the link mechanic itself to draw out the hidden potential of normal monsters, being able to convert all of them into their link counterparts, with both Imduck and Link Spider making it so vanilla monsters could combo by themselves. This was a truly impressive usage of normal monsters to facilitate this new mechanic, all while using them as a means to balance it. Other than these normal monsters, Konami would also print non-effect links. People may not remember this, but link arrows used to matter, and early on, Konami wasn't loose with how broken their effects could be, so these were a means of balancing at the time. Unfortunately though, the mechanic would become far more generic and far more powerful, making it so this temporary, well-balanced stardom would fade away rather quickly. This is where their legacy seemingly ends, left behind once more. That being said, there's still plenty more to say about their potential in the game on a broader scale. Outside of the meta standouts, there's still more to uncover about normal monsters when it comes to their potential in deck building. I think a great reminder of this fact was brought back to memory with the beginning of Duel Links. Duel Links in its early stage was similar to the actual card game during its early days. However, it wasn't just LOB format, but again, they had years of card design to work with in order to tune out a new form of Yu-Gi-Oh! While normal monsters with big numbers were a part of the game's early meta, it wasn't as simple as that. Cards like Order to Charge and Champion's Vigilance gave these cards genuine strategic payoffs that made them feel worthwhile to include. You may have noticed, I neglected a few times where vanillas were played in the meta during the discussion of their legacy. This is because I want to discuss their potential for deck building as a whole now. Other than stats and cards that support the monster type itself, vanillas offer another benefit. You see, monsters aren't just stats, they're levels, monster types, and attributes even. All of these factors have their own potential to leverage in the playability of cards. Dino Rabbit was a tiered strategy that was predicated on that very idea. Rescue Rabbit can summon 2 copies of any vanilla monster from the deck. This means you could grab 2 level 4 dinosaurs to overlay into Logia or Dolka. Extremely powerful cards that, at the time, weren't very easy to summon in actual dedicated dino decks. This was the most potent use of Rabbit, but it still had more unused versatility. Since the targets can be any type, attribute, or level of 4 and below, it creates a massive sandbox, with generic Xyz to even those with more specific material requirements. And when it comes to links, the only limitations are those that say more than one name must be used or that they require effect monsters. All of the rescue animals offer a similar level of support for vanillas, but it's Rabbit itself that was limited to them entirely. The latest rescue animal in Hedgehog also requires a normal. The issue is that it's a little too niche to see much play as of now. Hedgehog is a card that I hope gets further exploration and usage in the future. It poses itself to breed more creative deck building by using a vanilla. It emphasizes the potential that's hidden in vanillas. But let's dial things back to the less creative aspect. I wouldn't call summon 2 dinos for a negate creative. Hell, most people hated Dino Rabbit back in the day for that reason. But this was the tip of the iceberg for how out-of-hand vanillas could become. Rather infamously, Sunseed Genius Loci is the only singular vanilla in the game that people would genuinely consider worth banning. An unexpected die into this card could snowball into a sudden botanical hellscape. While I myself wouldn't say it should be banned, as I think there are other systematic issues that should be addressed instead, it's not hard to see why people feel this way. Fittingly, this card is the root of the deck, and if you take it away, it withers. While Loci isn't the only vanilla plant in the game, the fact that it's a Sunseed card plays into just how good it is in the context of the deck. It serves as a reminder that if every archetype had at least one vanilla, you could potentially commit heinous war crimes. White Duston and Dippity are light fiends. Yeah, so Unexpected Die is insane, except not really. Because Duston Turbo isn't exactly taking the game by storm. The fact you can just play Fiendsmith without hard garnets in a deck that summons 2 guys kind of makes this a non-issue. By no means is it bad, it's just a matter of it not being the root of the issue. I wonder what the root of the issue could possibly be. Guess we'll never know. As I illustrated with Fiendsmith, while they can also serve as a means of tapping into good engines, they also offer bad deck building decisions as well. Things like using these 4 idiots in Earth Machine. Why would you play them? Well, Bugroth is a level 4 for Gigantex. The other 3, well, I did mention Rescue Hedgehog earlier. The point is, while there may not be a million ways they break the game, there are certainly a million ways to evaluate deck building with them in mind. Going even further back in time, Advanced Ritual Art opened a new look into deck building with rituals. Rituals have always struggled with the economic demands they impose. ARA circumvented the economical issue with the mechanic while also using normal monsters as a balancing measure. Being able to send vanillas to grave is hardly concerning in overall game balance, so having you run vanillas as garnets for rituals was a great idea. Demise OTK was the first deck to truly use this design emphatically. Demise was a board wipe with big stats, but that wasn't the only part of the equation. Doom Dozer is another big beater that requires you banish 2 insects from grave in order to summon it. By summoning Demise with ARA, you were also setting up the requisite materials to summon Dozer, creating this satisfying card combo that could only be stitched together with the usage of vanillas. However, this sort of synergy wouldn't last. The general power level and speed of the game would leave this type of deck building in the dust. The combo of Demise and Dozer was always kind of cope. You were playing a sizable number of vanilla insects in the hopes you'd see ARA, Demise, and Dozer. While you could search 2 of the 3, and the game wasn't as fast as it is now, it was a little too inconsistent to truly be a reliable strategy. When it comes to rituals that followed after, ARA wasn't considered because there just wasn't the same level of mileage to justify running vanillas, opting to make better use of other requirements or materials. After years of dormancy, Chaos Max would resurrect the usability of ARA. Being an archetype that revolved around a vanilla made ARA a no-brainer in deck building. You were already running a vanilla by design, so it wasn't a brick you weren't already playing. Add to that, the new ritual also made further use of a Blue Eye sent with ARA to make another Chaos Max, which they later printed a second Chaos Ritual that furthered that combo's potential, making it even more tantalizing. Blue Eyes has a million ways to get these idiots consistently, and yet you didn't see this deck as an actual meta threat. Why is that? Well, you see, Chaos Max does nothing. He's just a big asshole that's hard to out. We were so close to making ARA good and just threw. Blue Blue Eyes is an archetype that is kind of a mess, using most of the summoning mechanics in the game. So the rituals are a more specific build, and unfortunately that build means forfeiting a concrete game plan beyond just summoning a giant bungus. But that isn't the end of the relation to rituals and vanillas. High ritual art is an inverse of ARA, sending vanillas from hand while summoning a ritual from deck. One of the logistical issues with ARA was if you drew the vanillas, you were screwed over if you didn't have enough in deck still. And even if you did, the ones in hand were still likely just rotting there. HRA changed that. This card sounds insane on paper, but it isn't. That's because you have to have vanillas in your hand. It still has the economical baggage of the ritual mechanic, with no payoffs in the materials used for it, meaning the ritual itself has to pay off the steep cost, and since HRA puts it back, it very well may not. Granted, it goes back at the end of your opponent's turn, so it can actually do something. Thank God there was at least some restraint in this restriction. But for a card that goes -3, they would have to design a deck or ritual that makes insane use of this. And it's probably best for the game's health that they don't do that. But we're still not done talking about rituals yet. This is a problem because I'm going to make a video on rituals at some point, and I'm using up all the material here. Magic Key is an archetype that functions just like a pseudo-ARA, giving you the ability to perform a ritual or a fusion summon using a vanilla from deck, provided you control a vanilla. While it's only for Magic Key monsters, their design opens up a sandbox, gaining effects based on the attribute of monsters engraved, giving ample room to experiment with monster types and levels that you want to use to unlock other gameplay synergies. Now we can finally stop talking about rituals and talk about hieratic. Hieratic is an archetype that was relatively playable back in the day, being decent dragon monsters during the era of the dragon rollers that utilized vanillas as a resource loop, with most of them floating into a vanilla from hand, deck, or grave when tributed. Wait, tributed?
No!
Well, fortunately for the ritual video, and unfortunately for my sanity, hieratic don't really utilize rituals, something that would actually make them better at making Xyz. You know, the thing that they do. Which is honestly a shame, just like the hieratic Gemini. That's right, they included a Gemini, because it's a normal engrave. You have to put it in grave. You can't summon it from hand or deck. You know, the reason the archetype's gimmick works so well? If only there was a normal level 6 light dragon that wasn't a Gemini. Oh wait, to be fair, Dragon Shrine's ruling with Geminis is pretty sick. Since it checks if the card is a vanilla while it's engraved, sending a Gemini lets you get the second dragon send, giving the Gemini some potential. It's just a shame that the Gemini isn't worth it even if the potential went somewhere. Speaking of potential, Red Eyes has a lot of design overlap with hieratic. Xyz, level 7s, a lot of recursion for vanillas, bad Geminis. It's just a shame they haven't been able to come together into a cohesive package. Hell, Red Eyes even has a ritual that could tribute off a hieratic for its summon. The potential is overflowing. The problem is, Red Eyes is pretty directionless in design, only really having burn as a game plan. Hieratic is one of the few archetypes in the game that revolve around vanillas in a way that makes you realize just how much potential they have as a resource. Tributing a guy to summon another name and a vanilla of the same level to Xyz as God intended, or even synchro with any of the vanilla tuner dragons in the game. The problem with hieratic is that Konami hasn't given them much of a modern touch-up. They don't have a spell trap searcher or even enough good names, leaving you to pray you just draw the search spell and some number of names. There's 4 halfway decent names in the deck, and none of them are traditional normal summons. And only one of them can be normal summoned without tribute. It doesn't help that they also have when printed on them. I don't know if they can miss timing at a crucial window, but the thought that they just might is an act of psychic terrorism that needs to be amended. For some reason, they gave them a rank up that isn't actually a rank up, and a new rank 8 that isn't all that good. They're an archetype of severely untapped design potential. How do I know this in my heart of hearts? Venus with Mystical Shineball was an incredibly strong resource engine to empower World Chalice. However, once you spent the 3, they were spent. With the design of hieratics, there's a constant loop to use more generic vanillas. So the fact Mystical Shineball's elevated World Chalice illustrates just how much value they can have with their recursive design. World Chalice is an archetype that I constantly come back to. It feels like an archetype that can perform nuclear fission, but it requires an understanding that no human mind is capable of to be used efficiently. They have just so much potential with deck building around vanillas. I just hope that they receive more support to reinvigorate that fact. Something a little more down to human understanding, but genius nonetheless, is Suship's interaction with Painful Decision. The deck is designed around a specific vanilla. This card's name is so important to the strategy that they printed another card with its name and made it really good. Because of how Painful Decision functions, you can send the original Shari and search out Shari Red. The only problem is that this is the only way to search the Sharis. Different discussion for a different video. The point is that by utilizing name sharing and vanilla monsters, Painful Decision can be another powerful search card even when it's not searching scales, creating a connective thread between non-effect and effect. Enchanting Fitting Room is a card that could theoretically be good, excavating 4 cards from the top of your deck to then summon all level 3 or lower vanillas it revealed. This works with Suship's stacking effects, except that it doesn't because Suship are all level 4. Needless to say, this card doesn't have much application currently. But the biggest issue with any of the numerous cards that support normal monsters is that they aren't searchable. So if they don't offer anything really good for a strategy, they typically aren't worth the deck space. The last notable piece of random normal monster support would be Heart of the Underdog, a card that allows you to draw an additional card if your draw for turn was a normal monster. Well, yes, you can draw a ton of cards off this, they'd all be normal monsters. So they're not exactly high impact unless you have something else going on. It's just a roundabout way to avoid having a dead draw in the form of a normal. But then you remember card economics and the fact you had to activate this card, as well as the fact you'd have to get to another draw phase in order for this to see any use. Yeah, this card isn't exactly good. With all of the jank out of the way, we can go back to talking about good cards. Giant Ballpark lets you pitch an insect from deck during damage calc. Then, if you sent a normal, you can summon all copies of that normal. The pitch being a normal monster has you load the bases, then from there you can take it home and end the game with a grand slam between all of them. This sort of design that provides a separate payoff to utilizing normals is more than welcome. It's another card that actually encourages deck building around normals, although it does end up being rudimentary in execution, as you'll only likely play one vanilla. More recently, Konami's begun to design entire archetypes that support normal monsters, with the first technically being Materiactor. Materiactor is a bit of an oddity. They originally debuted in Blazing Vortex as a TCG exclusive, but they couldn't really be considered an archetype. They were just the 2 cards of Gigaboros and Gigadra. They implied the possibility for more Materiactors, but considering the fact they only received a singular spell a year later, it seemed as though these cards were abandoned. However, very bizarrely, they would release a full-on wave of cards that turned them into a fully realized archetype 4 years later. Gigadra made mention of a normal monster in its text, so the foot was already in the door. It's just that with the sole context of itself, it was a means of making a rank 3 engine using normal monsters. Now that there are other Materiactors, they can do more than just that. Gigadra also had an Xyz lock that can be confusing. It only applies while it's on field. There are other cards that function this way, but typically those cards specifically mention it only applies while on field, so it's something you have to keep note of. Zept and Exorep don't have an Xyz lock, but clearly expand on them being a rank 3 strategy. Exoraptor lets you search a level 3 normal, and Zept lets you search a Materiactor. Zept also let you get a level 3 normal from Graveback, giving you the choice to summon it or add it back to hand, potentially letting you get back the card that Exoraptor or Gigadra discarded. Considering these released in Suda, alongside the Inferno Wing retrain, I imagine they actually wanted you to experiment with Materiactor Hero. They give you easy access to Avion and Burstinatrix to make it with them as a material. And Exiguard is a rank 3 that gives you a useful monster to get Gigadra off the field with, allowing you to bounce a card for having Avion or Burstinatrix engraved. Outside of this pack, you could also get Chosen by the World Chalice with them and potentially unlock World Legacy combos. There are many different level 3 normals that bring out a chain of possibilities. All the normal level 3 tuners give you the ability to make level 6 synchros. You can unironically play Bolt Penguin in a Penguin deck with Materiactors. You can play them with Adamancipator and make the synchro 6s since Materiactor also has an excavation gimmick. They can make Arianpas to kick off Goaty plays. They can make Silvera to crack a board. There really isn't a limit to what they can do. With Zept and Exorept, you can also make a 9. Importantly, a 9 that actually calls for 3 materials. There's also the benefit of making a 3 mat Croc, which kind of works with Materiactor's gimmick. Another 9 worth considering is Lightstorm Dragon, providing you with pops if you have more normals in Grave, which with Materiactor is very likely. If you're too psychotic to just synchro with them, you can use Materiactor to turn Controller into Repair and start a Gen X combo. Of course, you can make a swath of Link 2s with them as well. Romulus and Seals, since they're dragons, which you can also make Striker Dragon with one of them beforehand to also get Boot Sector, and of course, they can always make any of the Link 2 Charmers, making it easy to climb into a Link 3. There are also cards like Skeletal Soldier and Echidna that requires one material to be a specific typing, that you can gain access to with them. They can also make cards like Crossroads that need different types, and in the case of Crossroads, actually facilitate its effect well enough. There are just a lot of links Materiactor can generate access to, but we can't forget their strongest application. You can summon Silverfang. Very confusingly, despite deciding to make Materiactor lean into normal monsters, they didn't come with one in this set. Prima came out in Alliance Insight, which is even more confusing considering that in Suda, they made Tempura of Fortune, a level 3 normal pendulum, just like Prima, so it just looks like they managed to mix up the cards. I don't think they did, but I don't see a reason for doing this other than them actually getting them mixed up. Considering every main deck Materiactor is a different attribute, it's likely we'll see a Wind and Earth sometime in the future, both in main deck and extra. Lastly, released in the same set as the new Materiactors, is Primite. Honestly, Primite could probably be an entire section in and of itself. What Primite offers normal monsters is unthinkable. They mostly revolve around declaring a specific card name, with that being a normal monster and summoning it, with other benefits protecting the declared name for the rest of the turn. Cards that require you name a specific card is a mechanic that's seldom used in the game, so it's interesting to see it used in this way. Now, we've already highlighted instances where summoning any vanilla is a powerful thing to do, but Primite brings more to the table than just summoning them. Roar lets you summon any normal monster from deck by paying 2,000 life points. Unlike Unexpected Die, this can summon a normal of any level. Notably, this card is not once per turn and is a quick play spell. You can activate Unexpected Die, or more realistically in the deck, load and chain Roar to summon 2 normals. Of course, the summon from deck effects have limitations. Roar and Howl only summon from deck if you have no monsters, making it so you can't chain multiple together without one of them fizzling out their summon from deck bonus. Scream is a summon negate if you control a normal. It also resets itself, but banishes after being used the second time. Drill Beam lets you negate and banish a card by revealing another Primite card or normal, with the flexibility to skip the reveal if you already control a normal or the big Primite. Just like Scream, it resets itself, but unlike Scream, it doesn't banish itself once it's reused, which is insane considering it's much better than Scream, and you get to keep looping it. Since it's a quick play, this is a negate and banish you can get back and use again on your opponent's turn. Roar and Howl, to a lesser extent, also have interactive game effects. Roar lets you banish it from grave in response to an opponent's normal summon, then target a normal on your field or in your grave to banish a monster on field with less attack than the card you targeted. Howl's grave effect can only be used during your opponent's turn, but is more flexible in not needing a specific action to trigger it. It has the same targeting clause as Roar, but instead of banishing a monster with less attack, it takes control of one that has more. While it does give it back during the end phase, taking a monster is still a decent interruption. While Load is another card with the capacity to summon a normal from deck easily, it's not the important part. In fact, that effect isn't always used. While its attack boosting effect is a nice little treat, the only effect on it that actually matters is the search, allowing you to search any Primite card. Despite that, I still find it important to highlight Load's summoning effect. While it prevents you from being able to use on-field effects of special summon monsters the turn you use the summon effect, this prevention limits the activation. So if you're making end-board pieces with effects you're only using on your opponent's turn, it's not as big an issue. It also only prevents on-field effects, so any effects that activate Engrave or Banishment are still fair game. It's just that this sort of niche in design isn't commonly fulfilled with powerful strategies, which is probably for the best. Primite currently only has 2 main deck monsters, with neither of them being vanillas themselves. Imperial Dragon is the lesser of the two, but is still noteworthy. It can only be normal summoned by tributing a normal monster, but it is designed to actually function, allowing you to reveal it on your opponent's turn to normal summon itself or the other Primite monster from your hand. If it's tribute summoned, it negates all face-up monsters your opponent controls, and banishes monsters that have the same type or attribute as a normal monster in your grave. While solid overall, being only on the opponent's turn limits how good it can be. You can summon a vanilla without spending your normal to actually summon it on your turn, but spending your normal summon for the turn on it isn't exactly compelling, considering the fact the other Primite is going to be your normal summon. I think it's a card that I'll eventually find a use, but for now is a bit iffy. Ether Barrel, on the other hand, is way less baggage with way more weight. If it's normal summoned, you can set a Primite card from deck. That's all it needed to say, but it still has more to tell. You contribute it to send a normal monster from deck to grave. Then, during your standby phase, you can add Barrel back from grave to hand, creating an infinite resource loop that can get the spell traps from deck, while also sending normals to grave to support the secondary effects of the spell traps. These cards are an insanely powerful infinite resource loop for any deck that uses normals. That is massive for a card type that was once regarded as being useless. But it doesn't even end there. We later received more Primite cards with Primite Fusion and their Fusion monster. Fusion lets you make any Dragon Fusion monster by shuffling materials from field, grave, and/or banishment back into the deck, with the only real caveat being that one material is required to be a normal monster. Then Fusion has a second effect. By banishing it from grave, you can search a level 5 or higher Primite, incentivizing you to play at least one of Imperial Dragon. While this is a neat tool of a card, the card pool for Fusion Dragons that can include a normal as material leaves room to be desired. It can summon Zark though, which is what I consider a benchmark for a good fusion spell. Nether Berzelius requires one Primite monster and one or more normal monsters, gaining 1000 attack for each normal used in the fusion. It negates all of your opponent's activated effects, provided that the level, rank, or link rating is less than or equal to the number of normal monsters present in grave and field. To top it off, if it goes to grave, you can summon a normal from deck. It's not the most insane of floodgates, which is a good thing, but it does at least encourage you to actually build a deck with a lot of normals to really get mileage out of it. At worst, it's a card that screws over link ones, and I think that's something people actually want in the game. The only real issue is that the associated fusion spell is directly anti-synergistic with it. To further supplement fusion, they'd release a retrain of First of the Dragons alongside it. First of the Dragon Lords requires 3 normal monsters, can't be destroyed in battle, and is unaffected by other monster effects. If a spell or trap is activated, you can heavy storm the field, being a pretty solid card overall for one that uses 3 normals. It's a massive upgrade from the original, as it was just a guy you could sit on and not much else. All of these different cards that revolve around using normals find purpose for normals beyond being garnets. They develop ways to utilize normals as a resource for more powerful payoffs, leveraging the fact they're normal monsters as a restriction to how generic they can be. And wouldn't you know it, you can play Primite and Materiactor together and actually end up with a competent deck. Given the fact the cards make note to say level 5 or higher Primite, and since we have the latest support, it's entirely possible we see even more support for Primite, which means normal monsters still have even more potential to grow. Primite is arguably what has made Blue Eyes a meta-contending deck, an archetype that has always been historically looked down upon for always including a big vanilla. I never liked Blue Eyes on a fundamental level because I don't find Big Dragon, Big Number very engaging or interesting gameplay-wise. But now that there's a genuine benefit to running the card in general, people don't complain about it as much, which always bothered me. The fact you're playing a vanilla isn't the problem. It's the fact the deck sucks and there's a vanilla shoehorned into it. There are so many archetypes centered around normals that it's interesting just to see how well Primite can be splashed into them. More DM era cards like Dark Magician, the Face Knights, Magnet Warriors, and Red Eyes. The possibility of utilizing the normals and elemental heroes and gem knights for greater payoffs. Metal foes and even ignites are entire archetypes of them. Playing a World Legacy deck with the old vanillas for Primite access. There's so much potential afforded to these decks just by having vanillas. Of course, there's a reason Blue Eyes is the deck taking the spotlight, what with its powerful support finally having an outlet to properly channel it. The existence of Primite just makes all of these different previously disregarded cards all the more worthwhile to explore even further. Dark Magician is receiving new fusion-oriented support, so I won't be shocked to see Primite making its way into the deck to ensure it manages to contest the meta as well. To wrap up this section, it seems only fitting to talk about an existing issue with deck building around vanillas. There are quite a sizable portion of monster types with very few normals. And as I've been going on about at length, there are many ways for them to be utilized. So these types not having them also limits tools they could be using. While Pyro has 19 normals, almost all of them were printed during the game's infancy, with Volcanic Rat in 2007 and Garnet in 2011 being their latest additions. This sort of issue extends to the other types like Rock and Thunder, including the part where their latest additions are Gem Knights. There are other types with less than 10 in Psychic, Sea Serpent, Worm, Cyberse, and Illusion. While Illusion is new enough for only 2 to make sense, the same can't be said for Worm. Considering how well they can be utilized with Tenyi, there's an actual incentive to design more of them. Cyberse has 5, with 4 of them being released around the beginning of the Vrains era. Considering the fact World Legacy flexed how well normal monsters can integrate with Lynx, it's a little shocking to see so few of the monster type that's all about Lynx. Fiendsmith also served to highlight the more specific normal niches that are missing. While a light fiend existed, it was Duston, a level 1. They more recently made Dippity, which is a level 4. This means you can make something like Chaos Angel with it and Fiendsmith. But what comes to my mind is normals of level 6 and higher. 6 for the Xyz synergy with Fiendsmith, and 7 and above to work with Fiendsmith and Paradise. Just having normal monsters with these specific characteristics opens up a world of possibilities. This is of course only one example, one that makes it very apparent. There are only 3 fire normals that are rekindling targets. Just imagining the capacity to ARA away a bunch of normals, then rekindling them all back is insanely enticing, but there are only 3 of them, with 2 of them not even being real. There are a litany of different cards that could do even more than they already do, and likely in a healthier way than Fiendsmith and Rekindling, provided there were normal monsters that fit their criteria. It's something worth paying attention to. While you don't exactly need every single level and attribute combo represented for every monster type, it does feel rather neglectful that Konami seldom expands on a lot of them, especially when it comes to the types that have been around much longer. I just hope that the advent of things like Matereactor and Primite draws more attention towards these holes for Konami to actually start patching them up. Finally got to visit that harbor specializing in Gunkan sous ships that I've been curious about for a while. The premium Shari here is limited to 2,000 sous ships a year, and uses specially developed smooth-aged rice, giving it extra boldness not found anywhere else. The classy atmosphere made my heart sing too. The Gunkan sous ship served had a perfect balance of vinegar, nigiri shine, and shape, demonstrating exquisite artisanship. The owner told me, "We're introducing rich, yet mellow-scented Edofront red vinegar in the near future," which I'm really looking forward to. However, I was disappointed the surrounding seas were a little noisy, so giving it 4 stars with hope for improvements in the future. Check this out! Early on in the game's life, the text on normal monsters only served to provide a description of the monster in order to hype up the player's imagination while using them. This truly heinous and reviled monster boasts an immense power, unrivaled by even the gods. It annihilates all foes that cross its path. Then it's just a guy with like 900 attack. There's also the classic instances of the cards that randomly have a synopsis written by Joey Wheeler. "Hey, this mighty lizard man can swing his sword so fast that it's more than the speed of sound. First he's gonna grab your monster with his claws, then attack again with his poison stinger. This man like dinosaurs got a high IQ, even though he's lacking in the strength department. Kinda like yous if you had a high IQ, nyeh." A unique facet of localization of normal monsters is that sometimes it actually changes the text in order to further inform details about the lore, giving you more to go off of, provided you bother to check out the original text translation. Then you have Avram with perhaps the most mocked localization. I'm gonna be honest with you, I don't care that it shaved all the lore. The localization conveys everything that it needs to. This embodies the energy of hearing protagonist attack voice line 1 from a JRPG for the billionth time, which is also the deck's main deal being like Xenoblade. Imagine if every time you summoned a normal monster in the games, there was a narration of their text. Finally got to visit that harbor specializing in Gunkan ships that I've been curious about for a while. The premium curious about for a while. Limited to 2,000 ships a year. There are storylines that go beyond a single vanilla, both in being told with other cards in general, but also other forms. Gigabyte is a little guy that goes through multiple stages of his life. Gigabyte depicts him while he's Area's familiar. Gagagigo depicts his unemployment arc. My Body is a Shield references the face turn mentioned in Gagagigo's text. Giga Gagagigo and Go Giga Gagagigo depict his spiral into depravity. I want you to know that was one take. Then Gagagigo the Risen depicts a final redemption of him, being a non-effect Xyz, offering no words, only speaking for itself with his newfound sense of justice. There are the more short and succinct stories like the one told with Dragon Hornhunter and Dragon Core Hexer. She set out to slay dragons in order to cure her village of a plague, but in a twist of tragic irony, this act led to the dragons fleeing their den and destroying her village regardless. Now she's become a mindless and heartless killing machine. Now she herself spreads the dragon taint. What? There's also the story of Risebell, which was the first psychic vanilla in the game, with only 9 existing now. It depicts a story around the strength of sibling bonds, but is only provided the story's intro through Risebell before his turn, providing a tragic look at their days of peace that you know all too well doesn't last, with the words of the card only serving as a hollow echo of a time long since lost. A formerly cherished memory warped by current circumstances. This can be an effective tool to elevate card lore. Draco Slayer is an entire lore storyline revolving around a vanilla. We have Master Pendulum establishing our protagonist, and Vector Pendulum establishing our antagonist, giving a clear indication as to who's who in the story. Both Metal Foes and Ignites are archetypes involved in Draco Slayer lore, with their text of course elaborating on them themselves, providing the lore with more characters to attach to with their personality conveyed through their text. With Squire not only possessing aura in his artwork, but also his flavor text. The cold steel armor of this young Squire cannot hide the keen burning mind contained within. Then all the other Ignites have flavor text that basically boils down to, yeah, I'm a liability. What are you gonna do about it? World Legacy was a meta archetype and served as the first time Konami made a big and clear story within the actual related cards, using normal monsters to tell the story and lore, and the links to bring that story to life. Of course, the storyline developed alongside the game during that era, and the effect-oriented archetypes and lore ended up controlling the rest of the narrative. But it did serve as this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity where they were able to make a deck that physically told its story and was also playable. It's truly a marvel for vanillas. Then you have cards like Suppression Collider. All data crushed by this Network Warrior's hammer is irretrievably compressed. Is that why the War Rock arts look like shit? Was this your doing? Lastly, I'd be remiss not to bring up M-Warriors. Originally, these cards meant nothing. Just 2 dudes and a bit of magnetism between them. Then, for some reason, of all the monsters in the game, they show up in Evil Twin lore. Well, now I gotta see the M-Warrior archetype that explains their online career. Are they potentially using their magnetism to view bot? Wait, I just noticed there's a 4th, and it cuts off. Why would you present this to me? Now I gotta know who it is! Who could it possibly be? Wait a minute. Oh my god. Tokens are cards that are considered normal monsters. Early in the game's lifespan, tokens weren't too relevant. There was Scapegoat, which generated 4 tokens that would help build a defensive line and buy you time. This was one of the few instances where tokens were actually somewhat relevant in the game's life, but it didn't really have much to do with the fact that they were tokens. This laid the groundwork for the idea that tokens could be used as a means of creating a lot of sudden bodies, all while making them low impact offensively. Gores presented a new light for tokens, generating a token equal to the damage you took when it was summoned. Because of how the token functioned, people would then start attacking from weakest to strongest to ensure they get in the most damage possible in case of gores. Since creating a token with the biggest stat on board effectively meant they couldn't attack anymore, and they now have to contest with 2 big beaters. Unfortunately, tokens have never reached this same high in design nuance, returning to the structure of being nothing more than cheap resources. The only other noteworthy instances were cards like Dandelion with Quick Draw Dandy, and Gofu the Vague Shadow. Both were used as a means of creating tokens as a resource for other cards. Quick Draw would pitch Dandelion, which would then generate tokens you could synchro off with Quick Draw in order to make Drill Warrior. You could make other Synchron Warrior synchros like Archer, Berserker, Turbo Warrior, or Nitro Warrior, but Drill Warrior was the clear best. Gofu was a card that channeled this design more deliberately, but as it turns out, generating 2 tokens with a free body is a little too powerful. It helped the deck like Metal Foes generate free cards to pop for their scale effects, with the tokens also being usable as material for Alcahest, and it would eventually end up banned, not just because of this, but because of something we will get to very soon. Tokens had potential as resources for mechanics like Fusion and Synchro, but seldom saw too much mainstream usage. XCs are a mechanic that flat out can't use tokens because of how they work. So while they had seen some strong fringe use in the game's history, for the most part they felt well balanced, if not maybe a little underdeveloped in certain ways, making it so there weren't that many ways to exploit them in a game-breaking way. However, this idea of balance would not last. Master Rule 4 introduced link summoning to the game. Tokens suddenly went from being one of the game's most inconsequential mechanics to perhaps the most broken one in the game. Scapegoat came back with a vengeance. While Scapegoat was future-proofed in the sense that it prevented you from summoning the same turn you used it, it was not future-proofed to prevent the 4 tokens it generated from being used as link material. So you would flip it at the end of your opponent's turn, then have 4 materials to link off on your turn. And with a card like Galaxy Tomahawk, you could just supersede that weight, provided you could get 2 7s on field easily. It's really funny to look back and see all the token generating cards that had an irrational fear of you using them as tribute fodder, only for them to end up as a far more degenerate link spam enabler. Phantom Skyblaster is a card people know exists. That wasn't supposed to happen. Of course, this is all without mentioning how cards like Dandy and Gofu really can't come back now as a result. Also, links caused the Ojama market to crash. After they hit Scapegoat and banned Tomahawk, it seemed Konami had picked up on what they'd done. Well, sort of. They made a card like Linkross that could generate a ton of tokens, disallowing them to be used for links. Just one slight oversight. The tokens are level 1. Oh, I love it when restrictions don't actually restrict anything. Konami does seem to be more conscious of this issue though, designing most links to require either effect monsters to disallow the usage of tokens entirely, or make them require materials with different names, so as to leave flexibility for the usage of normal monsters while also working around the multi-token dilemma that Link's card design faces. Clock Wyvern is a decent example of modern understanding. It's designed to be a one-card link, but isn't utterly broken. Of course, Master Rule 4 is over with now, so a card like Scapegoat, despite being a 4-card token generator with its restrictions, is considered too slow by modern standards. And with more links being designed with that understanding in mind, it's hardly a concern nowadays. The most successful usage of tokens in recent history was in Sword Soul, and that design straight up locked you into synchros. There's an archetype I skimmed past during the historical relevancy of tokens, and that's because it's a great start to talking about token-oriented archetypes irrespective of competitive play. Mecha Phantom Beast is an archetype, something that a few people may be unaware of. Mecha Phantom Beast was originally most known for its rank 7, yes, rank 7 in the archetype that revolves around tokens. That might just give away why I didn't mention them when it came to relevancy in the game's history. The archetype can technically make Dracosack, it just requires your non-tokens lining up their levels with a specific token count. And well, the deck wasn't too good at getting 2 bodies on field for a Dracosack. Dracosack isn't the only Mecha Phantom Beast etched into the game's legacy. There's also Auroradon, a Link 3, that generated tokens. It does lock you out of links wholesale. See? We learned from Link Ross. We didn't learn enough, though. You may notice I've yet to mention a Mecha Phantom Beast from the actual deck. Well, that's because the cards are bad. The deck was more synchro-oriented, but for some reason, the tuners are the only ones that don't generate tokens, and the deck can't get more than one name on board to save its life, which makes it all the more confusing that they designed a Link 3 for them. Sword Soul is an archetype that, depressingly, is what Mecha Phantom Beast should have been to begin with. They all generate tokens, of which are tuners, to allow them to perform synchro summons with. To add insult to injury, they even have the level modulation integrated into the deck. You really didn't have to go that far. Although Mecha Phantom Beast's level setup is more interesting as a premise. It just seems clear Konami isn't willing to meaningfully explore it though. Most of the Mecha Phantom Beasts gain the levels of all tokens on your field. While they all fixate on the level of the token they generate being 3, not all of them are the same level, leaving room to place unique weight on each name as they provide access to different high ends of the synchro card pool. But since the tokens aren't tuners, this level modulation doesn't really mean anything. While treating the tokens as a resource for cost of their effects was interesting design balance, it was clearly too undercooked in implementation and didn't serve to help the deck function on a fundamental level. A deck that utilizes tokens on a much smaller scale, but to greater effect, is Sky Striker. The inherent design of the archetype is incredibly small in monster count, seeing as the deck's entire gimmick revolves around the spell count and grave. This leads into the genius design behind Hornet Drones. Hornet Drones is a token generator. That's it. But given the context of the deck, it is both multiple copies of a spell to put in your grave, as well as multiple copies of a body that you can use to perform link summons. The deck could probably do even more with token generating spells, honestly. Tokens don't really do anything special for the deck, it's just that the design around a token generating spell perfectly complements the design of Sky Striker, highlighting the fact that tokens can be used as an extremely versatile way to help a deck's core strategy. Phantasm Spiral takes the principle of tokens in a different route. They revolve around a single normal monster, but of course, they aren't very good at summoning it out. There's also the fact Spiral Serpent exists, but the deck neglects it entirely, which is something I could understand if they decided to care about Dragon's worm typing, but since they only care about the card being a normal, it feels like a waste that his original form was excluded from the game plan. The entire design of the archetype revolves around you controlling a normal monster to use their equip spells and powerful traps, with the added benefit that you can use your traps as hand traps provided you control Umi. Of course, we can't have a water archetype that doesn't have Umi as its field spell. Phantasm City generates a token when your opponent activates a card effect. Of course, only while you don't control another token. They don't want to let you bloat the board, even though the field spell has a restriction to lock you out of effect monsters if you use any of its effects. The token generation then lets you add a Phantasm Spiral card, and since their traps are all hand traps, and you have all the required conditions for them, it's live immediately. The deck entirely forgoes effect monsters as a game plan, and while I can respect the balancing of it, it does make the deck a little too restricted. Notably, it doesn't prevent you from using effects, just that you can't summon effect monsters. So you could use something like Water Enchantress and do adventure stuff to trigger the field spell going first, but that's all it could really accomplish. And it has similar restrictions to Phantasm, although ones that are easier to manage, so it at least resolves one of their issues. The deck's use of tokens as a means of being a normal monster for the deck's playstyle is great on paper, but the execution is clearly lacking. The deck intends for you to play Spiral Dragon and use the tokens as a bridge to it, but it doesn't work out in practice. It's entirely dependent on seeing the field spell to even function, both in consistency and token generation, and that does not make for a functional deck. You also need to attack with the equipped spells attached in order to summon Spiral Dragon, so they can't summon it going first, leaving any playable version of the deck to forgo the entire namesake of it. If they refined both aspects of the deck, we could see a phenomenal bridging of normals and tokens. As they are now, it's just an interesting proposition that's been half-assed. Speaking of token-oriented strategies that entirely depend on a field spell, Generator is a deck that has a strong dependence on tokens, yet for some reason only felt the need to have a single card that generates them. The deck is full of level 9s that are all meant to be bosses, with the tokens representing the underlings of said boss. Most of them forfeit monsters to activate their effects, with them needing to either be a generator monster or a monster of the same type, implying you'd play them generically in a deck that has those typings. Boss stage generates 4 tokens, so you can actually use the effects of the bosses pretty easily. The problem is, this is only facilitated by boss stage. Add to that, the fact that the tokens only exist during your opponent's turn. The deck ends up rather dysfunctional as a result. While you can activate the boss effects on your turn, the sudden lack of bodies means you won't be able to. There are only 2 monsters you actually want in hand. All the other monsters are big idiots that you can't special summon without boss stage, Lopter, or Vala exactly. And Vala has you pivoting into the extra deck instead of using them as a boss. While the deck could just have more bodies to summon easily, the token aspect really helps streamline the design for the deck, using them as an easy resource without needing to wrangle the potential balancing measures and cheating out cards with effects. I have to assume the reason they don't have tokens on their own turn is specifically because of the extra deck shenanigans with a sudden flood of tokens. But they could just disallow you from using them to go in the extra. It's not like you can use them to Exceed Summon. The thing that the deck actually does. If the deck had other means of generating tokens, they could be used as a means of tribute summoning out a boss. It also fits the theme of entering the battle once their underlings are removed. The most obvious restriction you could apply for these tokens is to only allow them to be tributed for the cost of generators, both in summon and effect. It's just another case of Konami half-assing the inclusion of tokens in an archetype. Generator can actually make really good use of tokens' general game balance as a fair resource, being cards that can't be used for Xyz and are solely designed to be fodder for the main deck's bosses, either for their effects or summon, but there's been no effort to expand on that fact, so half the deck's functionality doesn't function. This issue extends to another set of cards, but less excruciatingly. Adventure is the coined term for the archetype of cards that revolve around the adventure token. None of their cards share a universal moniker, so their functionality is entirely dependent on the fact they all mention adventure tokens. Despite having 15 cards, only 5 ever saw consistent play because they were enough of a powerful engine on their own, with the remaining 10 being pack filler at best. Their main reason for being played was Wandering Griffin Rider, an Omni-Negate that was extremely easy to get to with the other good adventure cards. Illegal Knight would have been a solid secondary payoff besides Griffin, but by the time it came out, the cards had already begun to lose relevance. The monster that made the whole deck work is Water Enchantress of the Temple. She gets you Aramesir, the card that summons the adventure token. The important part is that she performs this search as a banish cost from hand or grave, leaving adventure as an engine to be a low investment cost to include in a deck. She also has an effect to activate an adventure field spell from deck, but unfortunately, that's entirely irrelevant. The restriction behind adventure is in Aramesir itself, preventing you from activating on-field effects of normal summon monsters the turn you use it. So, for any deck that didn't really need a normal summon effect to resolve, adventure was an automatic inclusion. The problem is, there aren't many decks that don't care about their normal and can use adventure. It's probably best for the game's health that's the case, but it would ultimately be a big part of why they faded away in relevancy. Aramesir also lets you get Fateful Adventure from deck. This then lets you search an adventure monster with the need to then discard a card. If a monster is summoned while Fateful is on field, which you will after its search, it then allows you to search or equip an adventure equip from deck to the token, with their best equip being Dracoback, a card that just lets you bounce a card. On top of that, Fateful also has protection for your token so long as it has an equip. It's also relevant that all of their equips can equip to an adventure token if they're sent to grave, making the discard irrelevant if the card pitched is an equip, as well as making the equips hard to get rid of in general. Now, to put it all in frame, you have a card that searches a card that searches a card that then searches 2 cards. Other than being obnoxious in design and a power creep of searching, it makes the deck have garnets. Fateful and Dracoback aren't cards you want to draw. Griffin isn't the end of the world, but realistically you don't want to draw it either. Only Enchantress and Aramesir are the cards you want to see. This engine provides you with an Omni-Negate and a bounce. So what's wrong with the rest of the cards? All their monsters are free summons while you control an adventure token, but that alone doesn't make them worth playing. Tessia lets you search an adventure spell if you reveal an adventure card, except it can't add Aramesir, the most crucial card for the deck's functionality. But even if you could, you couldn't use this effect, because you would have had to normal summon it, which by activating the effect prevents you from using Aramesir, leaving Tessia to only search one of the 2 bad equip spells after you've already performed the main sequence. There's no flexibility or utility in Tessia's design. It's redundant at best and utterly useless on average. If Tessia was functionally additional copies of Enchantress, that would have been fine, but this design just isn't. It's especially questionable because Griffin can be summoned if you control a token or no monsters. Why couldn't Tessia have been designed similarly? Who knows. Tessia can search their only other token generator that was printed later, but it has far worse restrictions. Curse of Aramesir is a Timu version of Aramesir. It's a continuous that lets you make a token during the main phase. It also has Ascend like Fateful to synergize with the equips. And if a monster is destroyed, you can generate an adventure token to either side of the field. The issue is, you can only special summon adventure cards the turn you use it. It's clear they didn't want to worsen how generic adventure was, but adventure doesn't exactly function by itself, and its own monster lineup isn't good enough to warrant this luck. While the deck has more token generation than generator, on top of more ways to consistently see them, they hardly do much else. Their last monster in the lineup is Magicore. At the end of the battle phase, Magicore sets an adventure trap from deck after an adventure-related card does battle. Why? Not only does this require you go to battle, meaning you can't search traps going first, you know, one of the times where traps are actually usable, it sets it at the end of the battle phase, and it's not live immediately. Who thought a card like this was worth printing in 2022? The restriction in context with their traps is very much Konami's MO, but you'd at least think if it's going to set them at the literal worst time, you'd be able to use them immediately. Both Tessia and Magicore only serve as embarrassments of card design. Thunder Discharge lets you blow up your opponent's monsters that are weaker than your adventure token. Then you can attach an adventure equip from hand or grave to a monster. The token is 2000 attack, and the other equips do manipulate stats, but since the traps are basically unsearchable, you can't really justify playing this and the equips that aren't very good. Breath of Resurrection lets you summon 2 monsters with different names from your hand and or grave, then attach an adventure equip from hand or grave to a monster. While it can summon any monster, once again, it's an unsearchable trap, so it's just not worth playing. Despite having an equip gimmick, Dracoback is the only one worth a damn. All the equips attach to a token if they're sent to grave to make them really sticky, but that doesn't mean as much when it comes to Dunnel and Papillon. They're buffs and debuffs respectively. Considering they're multiplicative based on the number of adventure monsters you control, they're not even good, since only one of them goes on field and is playable. But even then it gets rid of itself for its own effect, meaning that it very well won't apply most of the time. Their overall impact is entirely negligible. The stat manipulation relies entirely on Thunder Discharge as well as multiple names on board in order for them to be relevant. It's needlessly clunky, making it so you aren't playing these equips nor the traps. There's no justification for doing so since you're already playing a bunch of Garnets for 2 good effects. There's no reason to play even more Garnets for even less payoff. The way they went about making the lesser equips better didn't actually make them better either. There are 2 field spells that provide effects if you have the corresponding equip. This means only one equip can be boosted at a time, and the benefits certainly aren't worth it. They attempted to address this design by also letting you cycle to field spells, but this is far too slow and weak to even humor, leaving it to feel like more needless clunk. Adventure has a lot of interesting concepts around a token being the face of the deck. It's just that the overall execution is lackluster for a dedicated archetype. I like that they're generic within reason. Not allowing on-field effects of normal summon monsters is an incredibly thin niche to work with generically. It's just unfortunate for Adventure, it's too niche now. And the deck has very little to show for by itself. I just wish Konami could better flesh out the actual gimmick of your token overpowering your opponent's monsters. Lastly for tokens, we have Dual Avatar. Dual Avatar is a fusion-based archetype, and a part of its gimmick is using tokens. The archetype is 13 cards, of which 2 are main deck monsters. Yeah, there's a mountain of problems unaddressed, but what's important is the 3 cards that revolve around tokens. Invitation fills your field with tokens, then performs 2 fusion summons. This sounds insane, but as I said, the deck is 13 cards, and this fusion locks you. It was a huge missed opportunity to tie in Contact Fusion with the archetype. They have only 1 fusion spell, so Contact Fusions could have given the deck some much needed leverage, and get value out of their token generation and other cards. This could be in either having separate fusions for Contact Fusion, or designing them to gain additional effects if they were made with a fusion spell. They sort of have that with the cheating out gimmick, but the cheating out gimmick is also bad. But the issue with any design this deck could follow is its token generation being concentrated in 1 card. The field spell lets you generate a token to match an actual monster from the archetype. The trap reborns a guy, then generates a token if it's not a fusion that you revived. The deck then also has a trap that can copy the effect of a trap or spell engrave, allowing more ways for you to potentially do this on your turn. This archetype's design has an extremely interesting premise with tokens, but it doesn't feel fully realized. I genuinely would love to see not just more support for them, but also an added normal to the archetype as well. Since the deck has a focus on tokens, it's not too far off to have a normal and introduce benefits for non-effects in general. I would just hope that a vanilla isn't the only new name they get. There's this clear theming of them fusing with the tokens to bestow power onto them. It's a mechanical theming that fits really well with vanillas, and it didn't end at just this archetype. But before we discuss that, there are some other things to mention to conclude this section on tokens. Tokens don't really have generic support. Token support, the card, isn't actually token support. Adventure isn't token support either, because it specifically requires an adventure token. About every card that revolves around tokens is like this, so there's no real generic token support, as it were, relegating them as just resources. Token Stampede is the only actual piece of generic token support in the game, and it's not particularly good. I don't see token control as being an interesting strategy, but I'd like to see support that's capable of bringing out the more unique elements in their inclusion in existing archetypes. There are unique interactions with tokens, but I don't believe there are any archetypes that leverage that fact. Evenly Matched has an infamous interaction with tokens. Since you can't banish tokens face down, if it's activated against you, tokens then become a priority for the cards you have to keep. Tokens can't be set face down, period, so any effect that specifically mentions setting cards is potentially sabotaged by tokens. You see, this is why Daruma Cannon sends as a contingency. Those pesky tokens. Not because of another particular card type. I bring this all up because, as tokens are now, they're purely used as cheap and easy resources that are of relatively low consequence. While I don't see tokens as having a ton of generic potential, there's a lot of unique aspects to them that have gone unutilized. I'd like to see more experimentation with tokens beyond just being a free body for decks. Something like further iteration on the connection of normals and tokens that Phantasm Spiral posed. Despite being classified as different from normal monsters, no official card database allows you to search for non-effect cards. And finding non-effect related cards is also needlessly convoluted. I bring this up because if I miss something egregious, you can blame Konami for making it harder to dig for these cards. Tenyi is the only archetype in the entire game to actually make use of non-effect monsters. They're designed in an inverse way to World Chalice. Whereas that deck had you summoning out multiple normals to convert into links with effects, Tenyi has you summoning effect monsters to create non-effect links, with the effect monsters being free summons while you control no effect monsters, with their graveyard effects being live so long as you control a non-effect. This design has their non-effect monsters drawing out and wielding the powers of the effect monsters. This was a masterful way to go about using non-effects as an intrinsic balance around link climbing. Since most decks can just link climb into anything if they spam out enough bodies, a lot of the time they can end up losing their own gameplay identity, or even potentially end up broken without proper restrictions. It creates a delicate balance of preventing decks from becoming slop, but also making it so they aren't solely constrained to their own cards. With the Tenyis, you link climb into your effect links like Shaman, Draco Masters, and Sahasrara, but stick with a Monk or a Berserker on field to keep all the grave effect requirements in order. This makes it so you need to only control a non-effect in order to link climb using the Tenyis. Since non-effect is a term that applies to all vanillas, this means they have synergy with normal monsters as well as tokens. This was a prevalent fact, as Tenyi Sword Soul was a tiered strategy. Although the fact they made tokens that met those conditions rarely mattered. And despite Tenyi also having a synchro theming, there was only one tuner and one synchro. And while the synchro was played, he was your second or third option for a synchro 8. This left Tenyi to just feel like worm slop to strengthen Sword Soul. Because if you looked at Tenyi in isolation, they really didn't do much on their own. Despite having distinct and unique gameplay, they didn't have the best structure in terms of an actual competent strategy. The original main deck lineup had 3 level 4s, of which none were particularly useful. Muladhara gives your non-effect monsters targeting protection, something a non-effect is almost never going to need since it isn't posing much of a threat to be a target. Shithana lets you reborn a non-effect if it blows up, but just as I said with Muladhara, a non-effect isn't posing that much of a threat. It's definitely more useful, but not really convincing you to play it. And Nahara is a battle trick from Grave. These are okay as niche tools, but they were half of the deck's names on release. There's also the fact you're implied to be using these names for the link climbing because their only tuner is a 1, and their synchro is an 8. Their effects don't correlate with the importance that they have posed upon them. Ashina and Vishuddha, on the other hand, are far more impactful in their design. Ashina lets you summon a Tenyi from deck, of course, while wormlocking you. And Vishuddha bounces a card, just generally good effects. Adhara, their tuner, lets you banish it to add back a banished Tenyi. Draco Berserker was their only synchro on release. He gains the attack of an effect monster he destroys and can attack another monster. He also has the ability to banish a monster that activates its own effect, serving as a means of punishing effect monsters, reflecting how Berserkers harness the power of Tenyi but in a more brutal and aggressive way. While Tenyi is another archetype subject to a divide of archetypal and non-archetypal spell traps, it doesn't have a searcher for their actual archetypal ones. Fist provides an Omni-Negate while you control a non-effect monster, and if your opponent pops it while it's set, you can cheat out a non-effect from your extra deck. Flawless Perfection makes your non-effects unaffected by monster effects. If your opponent special summons an effect monster, it just lets you Pot of Greed once per turn. Every vanilla strategy can use these crazy effects, so I imagine that's the reason they aren't very searchable. Circle and Cycle are 2 cards that aren't Tenyi in name, and are cards that provide the most support for them. Circle tributes a worm to search a worm, with the added benefit that you can special it instead if the tributed worm was a non-effect. Of course, since it gets any worm, its effect is negated if you special summon it, which means nothing for the Tenyis since their effects are in Grave. It also has a Grave effect to let you add a Tenyi from deck, effectively making it a search spell you get 2 uses out of. Of course, you can't use both effects in one turn, but since the effect is another search, it's entirely fine that it doesn't. Even if modern card design is trending towards cards that can perform 2 searches without this restriction. Cycle sends a worm from deck to grave, and if you have a non-effect, you can also add a Tenyi with a different name from the card you sent. These 2 cards are insanely good search spells within the context of the archetype, but it seemed as though Konami chose to experiment with search quantity over search consistency. There's a clear thematic structure where the level 4 spirits have reactive defensive effects, whereas your 7s have active offensive effects, with Adhara posing the idea that 1s are recursive effects. The effects of their links serve as an inverse of the spirits, with on-field effects that pertain to non-effects. Shaman, other than letting you extend, makes it so when a non-effect is involved in battle, you get to pop a card. Draco Masters pops a card for every non-effect on field or in your grave. Sahasrara served as a culmination of everything as a Link 4, providing protection for your effect monsters by forcing your opponent to only be able to target non-effects, making the effects of the 4s more relevant. You can also target an opponent's monster and generate a token with the same attack stat, facilitating its own non-effect requirement. The problem is, the design with the rest of this deck kind of clashes with this design. Getting both it as well as effect monsters that do something is near impossible, leaving the deck to put all its eggs in one basket. Tenyi would receive support to alleviate this issue, but of course, it was only 3 cards, and none of them were non-effects. given there were only 3, so one of them being a non-effect would have been catastrophic in that context. But 3 cards are not going to meaningfully advance and improve the deck's design, at least not in a way that could be considered healthy. So we ended up with cards that support the deck in the hypothetical world where they get more support. We got a single new spirit in Saruya. Being a level 4 tuner, you can now use to convert the old 4s into a Synchro 8. It's also more lenient in summon restriction to help with the deck's extension issue. While the old tenkAI summon restrictions prevented the deck from being combo slop, the fact their summon required you only have a non-effect made it extremely difficult for them to have more than one guy as an end board. On top of Saruya's summoning restriction alleviating that issue, it also just barfs out a tenkAI link if you use it to synchro a worm. Of course, you can't link climb with what it cheats out, and you lose 1,000 life points times the link rating, so you'd lose half your life to cheat out the only link that you'd want. Despite the more lenient summoning condition present, it still seems oriented towards being used last, as you can functionally summon a synchro and link with Saruya. While you can summon a non-effect link, you can't summon a non-effect synchro, so your other tenkAI summons are offline once you use it. Saruya fixes an issue with the deck, just not a fundamental one. Saruya tosses out a lot of the old theming of the original tenkAIs. Every other tenkAI spirit is depicted as a lone entity. Saruya is shown actively being used by Shaman. This was restricted to the card art for the links. Saruya also doesn't have a grave effect. It does in a sense, but it also breaks the theme that the 4s had with defensive effects, though they do establish the idea of light tenkAIs having effects that summon guys, seeing as both it and Ashina do so. I'm not against Saruya breaking convention, in fact it's welcome. It's just an issue that it's the only individual name added to the deck, so it's hard to rate it as anything other than recompense for making the deck rely on non-effects, rather than actually finding a way to further cultivate the deck's existing design. There's also the issue that they don't have a non-effect synchro, so synchro summoning immediately turns off any other extension, leaving Saruya to feel like a band-aid for a bullet wound. Muladhara is the new Synchro 8 they want you to make with Saruya. It can search any field spell in the game, with the balance behind it being that you have to have Worms in Grave or Banishment in order to do so. It also sort of calls out the Sword Soul version of the deck. Since they use tokens, only one Worm body would end up in Grave if you use them, so this doesn't really work with Sword Soul. You can add Flawless Perfection, but you'll of course actually be adding the new field spell. Before we get to that card though, Muladhara has more effects while you control a non-effect. Having multi-attacking like Draco Berserker, though you don't have to use it on a monster specifically, and it doesn't gain the attack of a monster that it destroys. And your opponent can't target or destroy Muladhara with effects. Overall, a really strong card in a vacuum, but the same principle with Saruya applies here. The deck needs more support for these to really mean anything. Muladhara does provide cope for future support though. The tenkAI names are rooted in the 7 chakras. However, Sahasrara is the only one that didn't have some alteration in its name. Vishuddha and Ashina reflect the original names, just with a different spelling. The lower level tenkAIs aren't the full words though. Muladhara forms a compound that creates the actual term Muladhara, and the same thing can be applied to the old 4s. Nahata becomes Anahata with an A thrown in front of it. Shathana becomes Svadhisthana with Svati thrown in front of it. However, Mapura has the middle ripped out of it, with the Ni from Manipura. I decided to look at the Japanese names, and for some reason, Mapura is the only one that changed. In Japanese, it's Manira, missing Pu instead of Ni. I don't know why they did this, but it still means it's missing a syllable in the middle regardless. So that means we're only getting 2 more synchros. It's also weird because the syllable that's cut out in English makes more sense in Japanese. It gives way to print a synchro counterpart to Draco Masters, a card featuring both Shaman and Monk. Since Ni means 2, a synchro featuring the 2 in it, with the emphasis on the added syllable of Ni, it feels like a no-brainer in design. It also gives an explanation as to why Mapura is an outlier that has a missing syllable in the middle, reflecting a connection brought about by the both of them. It's just a really bizarre detail that'll likely never get addressed. The last piece of tenkAI support is the new field spell tenkAI Infinity. It doesn't search the archetypal spell traps, but it does search the non-archetypal ones, which honestly are the better cards. Just really weird that there's an archetype that doesn't search its own archetypal cards still. It also allows you to activate Flawless Perfection from deck or grave at end phase, so it functionally searches everything, barring the Omni-Negate. If they were so terrified of you searching an Omni-Negate with non-effects, perhaps you shouldn't have printed it? Tenyi Infinity also lets you tribute a worm to pop a monster. Incredibly solid design, but once again, not a card that fixes the outstanding issues with the archetype. The archetype could have used a wave of cards with a focus on non-effect synchros. This could have served to add a new dichotomy to the deck, overlapping link climbing and synchro climbing, but giving the deck new mechanical payoffs by way of synchro climbing, using their non-effect requirement to further expand on the deck's capabilities, all while still maintaining that same balance to the cards. Right now, non-effect synchros exist as something you theoretically could make, but aren't worth the effort since there's no real payoff to making them. One of the issues with this latest support is that it only helps Tenyi itself, and only slightly so. It is absolutely frustrating to watch people complain about the Tenyi cards not being Sword Soul cards. The problem isn't that they didn't make Wormslop good, the problem is that they didn't make Tenyi an independently powerful deck with these cards. But this is just the issue with Legacy support as a whole. Instead of fully adapting and iterating on archetypes, the goal is typically breadcrumbs that technically make the deck better, but don't truthfully revitalize the strategy. They get Sahasrara, Circle, Cycle, Perfection, and all the fours more involved, but they didn't magically become better independent cards, only more functional. So they still need more to truly flesh out their strategy to be as reliable and resilient as it always should have been. You could play Tenyi with Primite, since Shell Dragon exists, and Barrel gets itself off field to avoid conflict with Tenyi. Between Sahasrara, the field spell, and the fours in grave, Shell Dragon is pretty insulated to make good use of the Primite cards. But Primite's design is unfortunately normal only, so the synergy is entirely dependent on Shell Dragon. They could just actually give Tenyi their own archetypal normal, and it'd make things a lot easier. Something else Tenyi could genuinely make use of is Gemini. It's the one archetype in the game whose design can actually make Gemini look like a competent mechanic. They're non-effects on field and in grave, so they have synergy with all their cards. Because all the Tenyis are free bodies, you don't need to use your normal on any of them. So, being able to use your normal summon to actually do the second summon of a Gemini fits in the deck's context smoothly, which leads into the one point of concern in their inclusion. Geminis are effects in hand, and unless there's some unspoken rule that Konami refuses to officially state, they can have the same special summon condition from hand as the existing Tenyis, making it so the normal summon of the deck is specifically tailored to performing an additional normal summon for a Gemini, giving the deck a way to build upon the idea of maintaining a non-effect on field, then allowing you to convert them to effect monsters for more interaction. To accommodate this design, they'd have to have more Tenyis with grave effects, designing them as quick effects that do something, then allow you to normal summon a Tenyi, allowing for you to normal the Gemini to then gain their effect. Of course, their effect should be more than the additional normal summon. They could be an evolution of the old fours where they have a defensive effect, but give you the versatility to also choose to use them for a normal summon if you want. But they could also just print a conditional effect that's relatively easy to run into to then provide the summon. It plays into the same mechanic relation the Links and Spirits already have, with the non-effect Links wielding the power of the Tenyis, and Geminis being a way of directly harnessing their powers. One last thing Tenyi could utilize is Gemini extra deck monsters. None exist, just like the hand effect Geminis. But unlike those, I can actually see why they don't. Gemini summon is a made-up term. It is officially considered a normal summon. There are no extra deck Geminis, and there are no pendulum Geminis, cards that also go into the extra deck. I'm convinced Konami just doesn't want you to be able to normal summon a card from the extra deck. However, if extra deck Geminis were a possibility, as I already explained with Gemini in general, this adds an entirely new dynamic to the archetype that truly empowers it. All of these different elements of non-effects in Tenyi could culminate in a card similar to Rekindling but for non-effects, allowing you to get out all your Geminis, non-effect synchros, and links, as well as normals, giving the deck a true way to go beyond Sahasrara. But as Tenyi exists now, it's just the surface of what can be achieved using non-effect monsters, since Tenyi is the only archetype to actually utilize them to any real effect. There are non-effect synchros and Xyz in the game, but they only really served as early period pieces for their respective mechanics. The same thing goes with the swath of non-effect links that aren't Tenyis. You don't really see a reason to summon them. Because the support around the non-effect category of monsters is Supernatural, Danger Zone, and the Tenyi spell traps exactly. There's just no reason to ever utilize these type of cards outside of a deck that specifically calls for them. And right now, no such deck exists. Right now, one of the only existing design directions for these cards is that of Tenyi, where you create material monsters that have conditional effects while you control a non-effect to make them useful by proxy. This works for Ritual, Fusion, Synchro, and Link, but not Xyz, since materials stay attached to them. However, Xyz can make unique use of a similar design structure. Ritual and Xyz are no strangers to materials bestowing effects onto them. The problem with non-effects having this design attributed to them is the fact that you could just do this with effect monsters, which would be better anyways. However, the fact they're non-effects once again brings in a means of balancing. Effects that bestow effects onto non-effects turn them into effect monsters, making them a sort of synthetic Gemini. But unlike Gemini monsters, their effects aren't set in stone on them. There's a variety of different effects that they can have, leaving their gameplay with the potential to be more diverse. It also helps that they don't require an additional summon to work. In the case of Xyz, this could be used as a balancing measure for an Xyz archetype, just like Tenyi did with Link climbing. You design a bunch of monsters that summon easily. In this case, they bestow effects exclusively to non-effect Xyz, making it so you can make more generic Xyz with them, but you lose out on their bestowed effects, which is the entire reason to be playing them. Effectively having a lock-in archetype without actually having a lock, giving depth to how you go about using your materials and when you go about making more generic Xyz. It also adds a layer of versatility with all non-effect Xyz in the archetype, since not any one of their names is of particular importance to the deck's functionality, making all forms of extra deck ripping useless against them in the process. The only real issue this hypothetical archetype would have to wrangle with is how good the bestowed effects are, and just how consistently you can find the most crucial ones for a reliable game plan. There is the potential to use rank ups, or more conveniently, evolutions in this hypothetical archetype, using non-effects with the main deck bestowals for varied gameplay, then going up a rank for a more linear game plan that you can consistently rely on, giving the deck the best of both worlds. The reality, though, is that there's plenty of unique ways to utilize non-effects, either as a means of balancing out a sort of gameplay style that isn't inherently balanced, as well as providing a unique mechanism for archetype design. But unfortunately, the only other use of non-effects are entirely fueled by forcing nostalgic vanillas back into the game without truthfully making use of them. BLS was one of the first attempts at this, but of course, it wasn't a very successful one. Beginning Night and Evening Twilight Night were cards designed to give effects to any Ritual BLS. They printed a new BLS, so you were just playing the original as worse copies of the new one, since they chose to only let you summon one copy a turn. On top of the design just invalidating the original, rather than building upon it, these idiots can only bestow their effects once per turn. So if you are just God's favorite child, and can make 2 BLSs with both effects, one still ends up a vanilla. Lovely. I appreciate that they convert your BLS ritual into a better version of the actual good BLS, as well as facilitate the summoning of it and actively synergize with it, but they chose to make these idiots near unsearchable. The one way to search them is with Super Soldier Soul's Grave effect, which you're not putting in Grave, because it's a level 1 in an even-numbered ritual deck that has ritual spells that require exact levels for its rituals. It's just a weird leftover of the half-assed attempt to blend BLS and Gaia into one deck. None of their rituals send both knights from deck to make up for how hard it is to see them. Synthesis kind of does this, but you still have to draw one of them. Considering the fact all the modern BLS ritual spells fixate on the levels being exact, having only 2 unsearchable 4s does not make for a functional strategy. There's also Envoy of Chaos, who's just a colute for BLS and Gaia, with the added functionality that he resets any modified stats on your opponent's monsters. At the end phase, you can banish a card from Grave to add him back. It couldn't just be a choice when you activate it, could it? If this were a card you could discard, then use to banish a card to proc an effect while getting back a material, it'd be cool, but it wouldn't be good. Why did you feel the need to design it this way? It only exists as a third body to use as a bridge with Synthesis to one of the other knights, with his synergy of banishing them being pretty irrelevant since it happens at the end phase. BLS would then receive a third ritual that only serves to further annoy me. It's a ritual that gains an effect if you make it using a normal monster. Remember how ritual non-effects aren't normal monsters? Uh-oh. Normal BLS exists, just not in the actual game. Why couldn't this have just been non-effect? Why did it have to be normal? This includes the existing ritual and the normal one no one can play. Why do this? It is a hindrance to not only the deck's strength, but also its thematics. There was absolutely zero reason to do this. This could have been a payoff to playing the original BLS ritual, making up for the misstep of the last BLS support. But they had to reference the fact the card was originally a normal for no reason. Because of this, you can only fulfill this thematically by using the original normal Gaia, which dedicated Gaia doesn't even play. They want you to play Gaia BLS, and the only level 1 to pair with Gaia synergizes with the cards that don't synergize with the Gaia build. They've designed non-effect ritual BLS not only to be obsolete, but entirely worthless, making it an entirely confused and clunky hybrid of Gaia and BLS. Gaia becomes BLS, so marrying the two together makes sense. But the way that they've structured them doesn't actually connect. They want to lean into the chaos aspect with sending 4s to grave that you can then banish for more combos, but they also want you to jam in Gaia cards with other random level 1s in order to make legendary swordsmen. This would make sense if they had dedicated builds for each strategy, but they don't! They're both half-assed spins on BLS. So what you're left with is a pile of jumbled garbage that doesn't function regardless if you choose to focus on one or the other. Nothing from BLS's existing design makes use of the fact the original is a non-effect, and Legendary Swordsman actively devalues that fact. The only thing it has going for it is that Dark Magician is a level 7 normal Dark, which better facilitates the Dark and Light Chaos build. And Dark Magician also has rituals, even sharing ritual spells with BLS. But they've evidently chosen to marry the deck to the wrong level 7 vanilla, given they're dysfunctional together entirely. Hungry Burger and Skull Guardian are two old non-effect rituals that would crop back up, with Novellis adopting Hungry Burger as a unique game plan, and Voiceless Voice adopting Skull Guardian for optics. Novellis is a ritual archetype all about cooking. They chose to make the big payoff for the deck summoning Hungry Burger by using your opponent's monsters as material for the ritual, giving the deck a form of non-destruction removal for the cost of running a vanilla ritual. The deck works without it, but it felt like a genuine reason to use it. They didn't exactly make use of the fact it's a non-effect itself, just making it a garnet with a solid payoff for playing it. But this would be more effort than Voiceless Voice put forth for Skull Guardian. Just like with BLS, they printed a retrain that entirely invalidates the original, then proceeded to provide absolutely zero design incentives to actually play the original. They printed a trap that summons him from hand or deck when a non-ritual monster is destroyed. Cool. If it wasn't a trap, the other effect would actually make original Skull Guardian worth playing. For fun, of course. But it does establish a difference in gameplay to apply to the vanilla Skull Guardian. The retrain has his attack double, making him pretty big, but gaining all monsters' attack stats while on field in his purest form reflects him embodying the prayers of everyone else, functionally harnessing all of their energy for a spirit bomb. Any potential support that intends to validate playing the original could expand on this, gaining stats from monsters in grave, banishment, etc. The idea of bestowing effects onto it like BLS also fits thematically. But since they chose to print only this, a single pack filler tier trap, the original vanilla isn't even worth it on a casual level. Before we move on to a somewhat higher note, it's only fitting to mention the other non-effect rituals that have been neglected. Magician of Black Chaos being perhaps the most egregious. They turned him into a fusion, bro. Considering he's another non-effect level 8 ritual, and already has established chaos synergy, it feels like a missed opportunity not to design support around it, and take a focus on including BLS. Bringing the two non-effects together to cultivate a ritual strategy around the fact that they're non-effects. Fortress Whale got a non-ritual retrain, and Zera the Mant got a retrain in Rush. I'm hoping that Konami is looking at these old vanilla rituals and considering unique ways to reinvent them. Fiend's Mirror could be an excuse to print illusion rituals and work it into a tri-type archetype like Chimera did. There's always an opportunity to use their nostalgia as a source of inspiration for something actually unique. I noticed something about Skull Guardian and Hungry Burger that led me to a theory though. Original rituals had redundant PSCT, feeling the need to include in their text the fact that you need to make them with levels that equal or exceed them, despite the ritual spells already specifying that. Of the 6 non-effect rituals that had this PSCT, 2 have received dedicated archetypes. Hungry Burger didn't have its PSCT updated until Noveles came out. I thought Skull Guardian received the same treatment, but no, he hasn't gotten a reprint yet. Very likely because of the cynical reality he's not even worth playing. Cool. The Masked Beast, Performance of the Sword, and Dokuro Rider all got reprints that updated their PSCT. However, Crab Turtle is still out of date. That means Crab Turtle will be the next ritual archetype. It's probably just coincidental though. Besides, I want a Dokuro Rider archetype. Do you know how hard it would go to be able to put this in Vendread? I really hope we didn't get scammed out of this potential future because they decided to reprint them randomly in a speed duel set. Fusion is the only other card type to utilize non-effects, albeit more so as free bodies. Ready Fusion is a card that lets you summon out a level 6 or lower non-effect fusion, creating a more balanced discount instant fusion, turning old vanilla fusions into extenders at the cost of an extra deck slot, which honestly doesn't really make them all that appealing in a legitimate deck. They'd finally adapt Flame Swordsman into a full-on archetype, and of course include the original in the deck's game plan. But just like every other use of non-effect monsters, save for Tenyi, he's just a stepping stone for the rest of the deck. The deck opts to cheat him out, then fuse him off with an equip effect to make Giga Flame Swordsman. I love him as a payoff, but everything else about Flame Swordsman the archetype is rancid. You have one name in main deck that gets the deck online. You have a Garnet that makes the deck's game plan function, but not a lot of ways to get to them. You have Flame Swords Dance that is specifically designed to not summon Ultimate Flame Swordsman, only summoning Flame Dragon to make an existing unequipped ultimate into the biggest kick-me sign imaginable. Then, to top it all off, because Ultimate being able to double his attack temporarily would have been too good, he has to die for doing it, just randomly making it worse than it should be. They have a quick play that searches and has the flexibility to be used defensively, design I very much appreciate, as well as the new Dark Flare Swordsman, but 9 consistency cards does not make for a functional deck, not unless it's Duel Links. Despite not focusing on non-effects, it feels as though the deck is actively worse while focusing on effects. The deck has a lot of ways to fusion and cheat out fusions, but Swords Dance doesn't let you summon the new guy that you actually want to make. The other fusions do nothing. So, by not having design that leverages Flame Swordsman being a non-effect, the deck does nothing but pop a card and maybe Book of Moon a monster, choosing to fuse Fire Warrior and Dragons without designing any that help the deck. Considering Flame Swordsman was originally meant to be a normal monster, it makes sense they decided to pivot into cheating him out, but I firmly believe, you made your bed, now lie in it. Make retrains of the actual fusion materials to flesh out the deck's consistency and game plan. Then introduce design that still encourages playing the old vanilla materials. Primite is already one selling point to do so. The archetype itself just needs a good incentive for you to actually make that connection. This provides an opportunity to blend both vanilla categories together while boosting the deck's playability and uniqueness. The only other suggestion I could offer is providing effects to Flame Swordsman if made with material, or more conveniently, if certain monsters are engraved, similar to Tenyi, giving the original Flame Swordsman all the strength a non-effect could ever need. You could very well use the control of the original to provide more powerful and archetypal payoffs. Maybe having the ability to branded fusion for a Fire Warrior or Dragon while you control the original. There are plenty of ways to use Flame Swordsman's non-effect status as a means of balancing out strong payoffs within the deck's own thematics and fusion. It's just a matter of honing in on that fact. The last thing I'd like to discuss about non-effects also includes normal monsters. There are 3 non-effect level 9s in the game, but no normal monsters that are level 9 or higher. This is supposedly because Blue Eyes is to forever remain the peak of normalcy. This is lame. It's just limiting card design for no actual reason. There's also the fact that there are no other non-effects that are level 10 or higher. That is, except for Blue Eyes Ultimate. It still stands at the actual peak, being the only level 12. The only thing that probably shouldn't exist is a non-effect rank 13. I never want to comprehend the horrors behind such a card. I mention this because it's clear there's even more design to explore around vanillas. Seeing as Konami refuses to let Blue Eyes fade away, it's kind of baffling to me that they haven't yet attempted to make ways to utilize the original Ultimate as a non-effect, seeing as the moniker also applies to Blue Eyes itself. I'd like to see any future support for them actually validate Ultimate in a way that brings out the latent potential in vanillas. Though, I'd prefer they channel this with something wholly original so that it can be more unique, giving purpose to the other non-effect fusions and Leo Drake. Vanillas are cards that, despite lacking effects, provide a world of opportunity for card design exploration. They can show the greatest strengths of simplicity in the game. They're cards that may seem unremarkable on the surface, but game-changing in practice. The number of times where I've thought to myself, if this archetype just had a normal monster, or if only there was a normal with this level, this type, was a tuner, etc., there's so much you could do. They represent potential in its rawest form. It's just a matter of harnessing it into something with more flavor than vanilla.